Preston Radcliffe leaned back in his chair, rolling the heavy crystal glass of whiskey between his fingers, a slow grin playing on his lips. The city skyline stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, the glittering lights of Manhattan reflecting the ruthless ambition that had carried him to the top. "You're losing your edge, Preston," his best friend, Damien, taunted from the leather chair across from him. "All these years, all these women, and not one of them has ever managed to get under your skin. Starting to think you're incapable of falling in love," Preston chuckled, unfazed. "Love is a distraction. It makes men weak. I don't do weakness." Damien smirked. "Then prove it." He leaned forward, eyes gleaming with mischief. "I bet you can't spend 3 months with one woman, no flings, no running, no cold-hearted exits, and not fall for her," Preston scoffed. "That's ridiculous." "Afraid you'll lose?" Preston's jaw clenched. He never lost. "Fine, pick the woman." Damien's grin widened as he pulled out his phone, scrolling through a list of potential candidates. Then, as if fate had intervened, the office door burst open. A woman stood there, breathless, defiant, and completely unimpressed by the power radiating from the room. She was striking long dark hair that tumbled over her shoulders, piercing hazel eyes that challenged him without fear, and a stance that suggested she was ready to take on the world. "Mr. Radcliffe," she said, voice firm, "I need a moment of your time." Preston arched a brow, intrigued despite himself. "And you are?" "Juliette Ellis. I'm taking over the Radcliffe Foundation's charity division, and I need answers about why funding has been stalled." Damien burst out laughing. "Looks like the universe just did the picking for me." Preston eyed Juliette, interest sparking in his gaze. "You're serious?" "You want a challenge?" Damien gestured toward Juliette. "She's it." Preston leaned forward, studying her like a puzzle he was about to solve. 3 months, no falling in love, easy. Juliette crossed her arms, unimpressed. "Are you done wasting my time?" Preston didn't know it yet, but this woman, this fiery, uncompromising force was going to be the one thing he never saw coming. And for the first time in his life, Preston Radcliffe was about to lose everything. The next morning, Juliette regretted barging into Preston Radcliffe's office. The man was insufferable, arrogant, too rich for his own good, but she wasn't here to be intimidated. She had a cause to fight for. She paced outside his building, clutching her folder of documents. She had spent years working her way up in the nonprofit sector, dedicating her life to causes that mattered. Unlike Preston, who probably spent his days sipping whiskey in a suit worth more than her entire apartment. A black luxury car pulled up to the curb, and before she could react, the back door swung open. "Get in," Preston's voice commanded. Juliette blinked. "Excuse me?" "You want answers about the foundation? I have a meeting in 30 minutes. Talk while we drive." She hesitated. She didn't trust men like him, men who thought the world bent to their will. But she wasn't going to back down either. With a sigh, she slid into the car, the leather seats soft beneath her. Preston sat beside her, impossibly composed, watching her with a gaze that made her feel like she was part of some game he was playing. "Why did the foundation freeze funding for the shelter project?" she demanded. Preston poured himself a coffee from the car's built-in bar. "Because I don't throw money at things without understanding where it's going," Juliette bristled. "It's going to people who need it." "And what makes you so sure?" Her jaw tightened. "Because I've been there, I've worked in those shelters, I've seen the families who rely on them." Something flickered in his expression, something unreadable, but it was gone before she could decipher it. "I'll look into it," he said, sipping his coffee. "That's not good enough." Preston set his cup down, turning to face her fully. "Then convince me." She should have been intimidated. Instead, she met his gaze head-on. "Fine, come with me." His brows lifted. "Where?" "To the shelters, see for yourself." Preston rarely did anything outside of his carefully controlled world. But there was something about the way Juliette challenged him, something that made him want to say yes just to see what would happen. "All right," he said, surprising himself. "Take me there." Juliette hadn't expected him to agree. But as the car pulled away, she had the distinct feeling that, for better or worse, She had just set something in motion that neither of them could stop. And Preston Radcliffe. He had no idea that the woman sitting beside him was about to turn his world upside down. The moment Preston Radcliffe stepped out of his sleek luxury car and onto the cracked pavement outside the shelter, he knew he was out of his element. The towering skyscrapers of his world had been replaced by aging brick buildings, their exteriors worn by time and hardship. The scent of freshly baked bread from a nearby bakery mixed with the faint, metallic tang of the city, a stark contrast to the pristine, climate-controlled spaces he was used to. Juliette walked ahead, her stride purposeful, her presence commanding in a way that had nothing to do with wealth or power. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She belonged here. Preston didn't. Inside, the shelter was buzzing with quiet activity. Volunteers moved between tables, serving meals to families huddled together, their eyes weary but grateful. Children clutched donated toys, their laughter at odds with the reality of their circumstances. The air was thick with a mixture of resilience and desperation. Juliette turned to him, arms crossed. "You wanted proof, here it is." Preston's gaze swept the room, taking in every detail. He had spent years mastering the art of reading people, gauging motives, identifying weaknesses, but there was no pretense here, no hidden agendas. Just people trying to survive. A woman in her 60s approached, her expression warm but questioning. "Juliette, didn't expect you today." Juliette smiled, her posture relaxing. "Hey, Linda. I brought someone to see the work we're doing." Linda's gaze shifted to Preston, sharp and assessing. "And he is." Preston extended a hand. "Preston Radcliffe." Recognition flickered across Linda's face, followed by something far less welcoming. "Ah, the man holding the purse strings." Juliette tensed beside him, but Preston merely nodded. "I prefer to call it being cautious." Linda let out a quiet laugh, shaking his hand firmly. "Caution is fine, Mr. Radcliffe, but people don't eat promises." Preston didn't flinch. "I don't make promises I can't keep." Juliette exhaled sharply, clearly frustrated. "Then let's make sure you keep this one." Linda motioned for them to follow her. They weaved through the shelter, passing makeshift sleeping areas where thin blankets barely concealed the cold reality beneath them. A little girl peeked out from behind a cot, clutching a well-loved stuffed bear. Her brown eyes met Preston's, wide and unguarded. Juliette crouched beside her, voice soft. "Hey, Mia, how's Mr. Bear today?" The girl hesitated before whispering, "He's hungry." Preston's chest tightened, an unfamiliar sensation creeping in. He had sat across from world leaders, negotiated billion-dollar deals, and crushed competitors without hesitation. Yet here he was, undone by a child's quiet admission. Juliette reached into her bag, pulling out a small granola bar. "Think this will help?" Mia nodded, taking it carefully, her tiny fingers brushing Juliette's as if she were afraid it might disappear. Preston cleared his throat, shoving his hands into his pockets. "What does she need?" Juliette looked up, surprised. "Excuse me," he gestured toward Mia. "What would make her life better, specifically?" Juliette studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decipher whether he was serious. "A stable home, regular meals, a school that doesn't treat kids like her as an afterthought." Preston nodded. "Done." Linda's brows lifted. "Just like that?" "I don't waste time," Preston said simply. Juliette straightened, skepticism clear in her expression. "You think throwing money at the problem fixes it?" Preston met her gaze, unwavering. "I think money removes barriers. And once those are gone, people like you can do the real work." For the first time since they met, Juliette hesitated. Her usual fire was still there, but something in her expression shifted. Linda clapped her hands together. "Well, if you're serious, Mr. Radcliffe, we have a lot to discuss." Preston inclined his head. "Send me the details." As they walked back to the car, Juliette remained unusually quiet. Preston wasn't used to people doubting his intentions. He was used to being the one in control, the one making the rules. But with her, nothing was predictable. Finally, she spoke. "Why did you really agree to come here?" He didn't answer immediately. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure. What had started as a challenge, a game, now had real stakes. He wasn't just here to win a bet anymore. "I wanted to see what mattered to you," he admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. Juliette stopped walking, turning to face him. The streetlights cast a soft glow on her features, highlighting the determination in her eyes. "And," Preston exhaled slowly, "now I know." For the first time in his life, he wasn't certain if that was a good thing, because something about Juliette Ellis was unraveling the careful walls he had built, and Preston Radcliffe never let anyone get close enough to do that. Preston Radcliffe had spent his life mastering control. Control over his empire, his emotions, and the people who thought they could get close to him. But as he sat in the back of his car, staring out at the blur of city lights, he felt something foreign slip through the cracks, a restlessness he couldn't define. Juliette Ellis had done something no one else had managed. She had made him see beyond the pristine walls of his world, past the carefully curated deals and cold efficiency of his life. And worse, she had made him care. He loosened his tie, exhaling slowly. This wasn't part of the plan. He had agreed to Damien's ridiculous bet because it was supposed to be easy. 3 months with a woman, no emotional entanglements, and then he'd walk away unaffected as always. But Juliette wasn't like the women who floated through his life, dazzled by wealth and status. She was fire and conviction, refusing to be impressed by his world of luxury. And now she was in his head. The next morning, he arrived at his office earlier than usual, but his mind wasn't on business. His assistant, Claire, handed him a schedule, rattling off meetings and numbers, but the words barely registered. Instead, his thoughts drifted to Juliette, to the way she had looked at him last night, not with admiration or expectation, but with quiet scrutiny, as if trying to figure out what kind of man he truly was. He wasn't sure he had an answer. Damien strolled into his office without knocking, dropping into the chair across from him, far too amused for Preston's liking. "Well," Damien drawled. "How's the bet going?" Preston shot him a look. "It's under control." Damien laughed, shaking his head. "That's not what I heard." Preston frowned. "What exactly did you hear?" "That you spent the evening touring a shelter instead of sipping a $1,000 bottle of scotch in your penthouse." Damien leaned forward, his grin widening. "Admit it, she's getting to you." Preston's jaw tightened. "She's a challenge." "That's all." Damien studied him, then let out a low chuckle. "Right, keep telling yourself that." Preston didn't respond. He hated losing, and he refused to accept that this was anything more than a game. But later that evening, when he found himself driving toward the shelter instead of his usual dinner reservation, he knew he was lying to himself. Juliette was at the front desk when he arrived, deep in conversation with a volunteer. She looked up, startled to see him. "You're back," she said, watching him warily. "I told you I don't waste time," he replied smoothly. "I want to see more." She hesitated, clearly debating whether to let him in again. Then, with a sigh, she gestured for him to follow. They walked through the shelter in silence. Preston observed everything with the same sharp focus he applied to business deals, but this wasn't about profit margins or strategic advantages. It was about understanding why Juliette fought so fiercely for these people, and why he couldn't seem to walk away. They reached a small common area where children played with donated toys. A boy, no older than 8, sat in the corner, gripping a worn backpack. His expression was guarded, his posture tense. Juliette crouched beside him, her voice gentle yet firm. "Alex, have you eaten today?" The boy shook his head but didn't say anything. Preston watched as Juliette reached into her bag and handed him a sandwich. Alex took it hesitantly, his eyes darting between them. "You don't have to be afraid," Juliette assured him. "You're safe here." Preston's chest tightened at the quiet reassurance in her voice. He had spent his life in boardrooms, negotiating deals worth millions, but this was more powerful than anything he had ever witnessed. Later, as they stood outside, the air crisp with the promise of rain, Juliette turned to him. "Why are you really here, Preston?" He met her gaze, the usual glib response stuck in his throat. He could lie, pretend this was just about the bet, but for the first time in his life he didn't want to. I don't know, he admitted. Juliette studied him, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she walked away, leaving him standing there, unsettled in a way he had never been before. Preston Radcliffe had built an empire by keeping his emotions locked behind an impenetrable wall. But as he stood in the pouring rain outside the shelter, watching Juliette disappear through the doors without a backward glance, he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just intrigue anymore. It wasn't just a challenge, it was her. Days passed, but she was everywhere in his mind. The way she carried herself with unwavering conviction. The way she spoke about the people she fought for, as if their battles were her own. The way she looked at him not with awe, but with expectation, as if daring him to prove he was more than just another billionaire with a passing interest in charity. And for the first time in his life, Preston wanted to be more. The realization hit him in the middle of a high-stakes board meeting. He was supposed to be reviewing a strategic acquisition, but the words on the screen blurred, his attention fractured. He had spent years chasing power, structuring his life around control, but now all he could think about was whether Juliette had eaten that day or if she was still working late at the shelter, pushing herself too hard. It was unacceptable and completely out of his control. That evening, he found himself outside the shelter again, his driver waiting by the curb as he stepped into the dimly lit street. Inside, Juliette was organizing supplies, her focus entirely on the task at hand. She didn't notice him at first, but when she turned and saw him standing there, something flickered in her expression, something unreadable, something dangerous. "You're back," she said. He took a step closer, hands in his pockets, his suit slightly damp from the misting rain outside. "I wanted to see you." Juliette folded her arms, studying him carefully. "Why?" The question was simple, but the answer wasn't. He was supposed to be the one in control, the one who dictated the terms. But with her, none of the rules applied. "Because I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted. Juliette inhaled sharply, her guard visibly rising. "Preston," he shook his head, cutting her off. "I know what you think of me, that this is some passing interest, that I'll lose focus the moment something more convenient comes along. But that's not what this is." She held his gaze, the air between them charged with something neither of them could deny. "Then what is it?" Preston exhaled slowly. "I don't know how to describe it. I just know that my life hasn't felt right since you walked into it." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truths. Then Juliette did something that shattered any remaining illusions he had about walking away. She stepped forward and pressed her palm against his chest. It wasn't an embrace, wasn't a declaration, but it was something. A question. A test. Preston covered her hand with his own, his fingers brushing against her skin, warm and steady. It was the first time in his life that he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And then, as if the moment had never happened, Juliette pulled away. "This isn't your world, Preston," she said softly. "You don't belong here." He should have agreed, should have walked away. Instead, he did the one thing he had never done before. He fought for something that wasn't about power or control. "Then show me how to," he said. Juliette stared at him, uncertainty flashing across her face, but she didn't push him away, and that was all the permission he needed. Preston didn't do things halfway. When he committed fully. So when he told Juliette he wanted to understand her world, he meant it. Over the next few weeks, he showed up not just with donations or promises, but with his time. He listened. He learned. He let himself be uncomfortable, let himself be challenged. And Juliette, despite her initial skepticism, began to let him in. One evening, after an exhausting day at the shelter, they ended up at a small cafe tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. It was nothing like the restaurants Preston was used to. No private booths, no expensive wine lists, no waiters hovering at the ready. Just mismatched chairs, the scent of fresh bread, and the sound of quiet laughter from the other patrons. Juliette stirred her tea, her expression thoughtful. "I didn't think you'd last this long." Preston arched a brow. "You thought I'd give up?" She met his gaze, unflinching. "I thought you'd get bored." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. I don't get bored with things that matter. Her breath hitched just slightly, but she recovered quickly, changing the subject. The kids at the shelter have been asking about you, he smirked. I'm assuming the reviews are mixed, Juliette chuckled. Mia thinks you're a superhero, Alex thinks you're a secret spy, Linda thinks you're trying to buy your way into heaven. And what do you think? She hesitated, her fingers tightening around her mug. I think you're surprising me. Preston reached across the table, brushing his knuckles against hers. It was the smallest touch, but it sent a current of electricity between them. I'm not done surprising you yet, he murmured. Juliette didn't pull away. And that was when he knew he had already lost the bet. Because this wasn't a game anymore. This was real. And for the first time in his life, he didn't want to win, he just wanted her. Preston Radcliffe was not a man who second-guessed himself. Yet ever since Juliette Ellis had stormed into his life, certainty had become an elusive concept. He arrived at his office earlier than usual, the city still waking up beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. His assistant hovered by his desk, waiting for the usual nod of acknowledgement before beginning her daily rundown of meetings. But today, Preston barely heard her. His mind was somewhere else, somewhere filled with the scent of fresh bread from that tiny cafe, the warmth of Juliette's fingers brushing against his, and the way she had looked at him, as if she were seeing something beneath the polished surface he had spent years perfecting. He had spent weeks proving he wasn't just another billionaire with a fleeting interest in charity. He had immersed himself in her world, not just for the sake of winning a bet, but because something inside him had shifted. He wanted to understand why she fought so fiercely, why she never backed down, why she had become the one person he couldn't ignore. And now, for the first time in his life, he was afraid. Afraid that if he let her in completely, she would see the parts of him he had carefully hidden behind wealth, power, and control. Damien strode into the office without knocking, as he always did, dropping into the chair across from Preston's desk with an air of triumph. It's been nearly 2 months, Damien said, stretching out lazily. You've lasted longer than I expected, but let's be honest, you're in trouble. Preston didn't respond. Damien laughed, shaking his head. You don't even deny it anymore. He leaned forward, his expression shifting from amusement to something more serious. You're not playing a game anymore, are you? Preston exhaled, running a hand through his hair. No, he admitted, I'm not. Damien studied him, then let out a low whistle. Well, that's a first. Preston glanced at him, jaw tightening. What do I do? Damien's brows lifted. You're asking me for advice on women, that's a first too. Preston shot him a look and Damien sighed. All right, fine, let's break this down. You took a bet that you wouldn't fall in love, and now you're sitting here acting like a man who's already lost. So either you walk away and pretend none of this happened, or that's not an option, Preston cut in. Damien's expression softened slightly. Then tell her the truth. Preston's stomach twisted. The truth meant admitting the bet. It meant risking everything, the trust she had started to place in him, the fragile connection they had built. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was walking away from the only thing that had ever felt real. That evening, he found himself outside Juliette's apartment, heart pounding in a way that was foreign and unwelcome. He had faced down corporate titans, negotiated billion-dollar deals, but standing at her door, waiting for her to answer, felt like the most terrifying gamble of his life. When she opened the door, her expression shifted from surprise to curiosity. Preston. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped inside, suddenly unable to bear the distance between them. I need to tell you something, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Juliette crossed her arms, her eyes searching his. What is it? He took a deep breath, the weight of his next words pressing down on him. It started as a bet. The moment the words left his mouth, he saw the change in her. The flicker of hurt, the tightening of her jaw, the way her shoulders straightened as if bracing for impact. A bet, she repeated slowly. Damien challenged me to spend 3 months with a woman without falling for her, Preston admitted, forcing himself to meet her gaze. I thought it would be easy, I thought none of it would matter. Juliette's expression hardened. "And I was the woman you chose." "You weren't chosen," Preston said quickly. "You walked into my office that day and Damien, he picked you as a joke. But it stopped being a game the moment I really saw you." Juliette let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh, stepping back. "You expect me to believe that?" "I don't expect anything," Preston said, his voice raw. "But I need you to know this isn't a game to me anymore. It hasn't been for a long time." Juliette shook her head, her eyes flashing with anger. "So what was the plan? String me along for 3 months, then walk away when the bet was over? Did you think I wouldn't find out?" "Juliette, no," she cut him off, her voice shaking. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to play with people's lives and then act like you suddenly grew a conscience." Preston took a step closer, but she moved back. The distance between them felt insurmountable. "I swear to you," he said, his voice low, desperate, "I never meant to hurt you. I never expected any of this, but I won't walk away from you now." Juliette exhaled sharply, pressing a hand to her forehead. "I don't know if I can believe you." The words cut deeper than he expected, but he nodded. "Then I'll prove it." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for a moment he thought he saw something soften in her gaze. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Without another word, she opened the door. Preston didn't argue, he didn't beg. He walked out, knowing that if he wanted any chance at winning her back, it wouldn't be with words. It would be with actions. And Preston Radcliffe had never been more determined to win in his life. Preston Radcliffe had faced countless adversaries in the business world, but nothing had prepared him for the ache of losing Juliette. The emptiness of his penthouse, the silence of his phone, the absence of her sharp wit and defiant fire, it gnawed at him in ways he couldn't ignore. For days, he let her have space, knowing that chasing her with words wouldn't be enough. He had built his empire on action, on proving his worth through what he did, not what he said. And if that was the only way to win Juliette back, then he'd give everything to make it happen. The first step was ensuring that her life's work, the shelter, the people she fought for, was stronger than ever. He met with her colleagues, arranged meetings with city officials, and secured funding that would keep their programs running for years. But it wasn't just about money. He made sure the shelters had resources, connections, and legal protections. He put his influence to work not for himself but for her. Still, Juliette remained distant. She acknowledged his efforts through others but never reached out. It wasn't enough. She needed to see that he had changed, not just for her, but because she had forced him to see the world differently. Then an idea struck him, one last move that wasn't about grand gestures or wealth, but about proving where he truly stood. The annual Radcliffe Foundation Gala was one of the most exclusive events in the city, a night where the elite gathered to flaunt their influence under the guise of philanthropy. It had always been a spectacle of wealth, a carefully curated illusion of generosity. But this year, Preston was going to rewrite the script. On the night of the gala, as the city shimmered under the glow of 1,000 lights, Juliette arrived in a simple but elegant dress, looking every bit as striking as she always did. She had been invited, of course, but she had no intention of staying long. She had seen enough of these events to know they were more about appearances than real change. But as she stepped into the ballroom, something was different. Instead of the usual displays of extravagance, the room was filled with images of the shelter, stories of the people who had been helped, real faces instead of nameless causes. At the center of it all stood Preston. He saw her the moment she entered, his breath catching in a way he never would have admitted before. She was here. That meant something. With measured steps, he crossed the room, the crowd parting as if sensing that something far more important was unfolding. When he reached her, he didn't speak right away. He let her take in what he had done, the shift in priorities, the undeniable proof that he had listened. Finally, her eyes met his, and for the first time in weeks, she wasn't guarded. "You did all this?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. He nodded. "Not for a bet, not for an image, for you, because you were right about me, and I hated that. But more than that, I hated the idea of losing you." Emotion flickered across her face, but she held her ground. And what happens when the novelty wears off, when this isn't new anymore? Preston took a step closer, closing the distance between them. Then I keep proving it, every single day, because this isn't about a single moment, Juliette. It's about the rest of my life. She exhaled softly, and he could see the walls she had built so carefully beginning to crack. Then, in front of the entire room, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but Preston didn't care. His world had always been calculated, every move meticulously planned. But this was the first time he was acting purely on feeling. Slowly, he dropped to one knee. "Marry me," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "Not because it's expected, not because it's the next step, but because you changed me, because I don't want a life where you're not in it." Juliette stared at him, her breath caught between disbelief and something dangerously close to hope. "You can't just decide," she started, but he shook his head. "I can and I have, but the only thing that matters is whether you'll say yes." For a long moment, she didn't move. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a slow, almost disbelieving smile, she whispered, "Yes." The room erupted, but Preston barely heard it. He was already on his feet, already pulling her into his arms, already claiming the only victory that had ever mattered. And as their lips met, sealing a promise far greater than wealth or power, he knew this was the only gamble he had ever truly won. The wedding was nothing like what the world expected from Preston Radcliffe. It wasn't a grand spectacle, wasn't filled with flashing cameras and society's elite. Instead, it was intimate, held in a quiet garden surrounded by the people who truly mattered. Juliette wore a dress that wasn't designer but made her feel like herself. Preston stood beside her, looking freer than he ever had in his life. There were no elaborate displays, no excessive luxuries, just the undeniable truth that they had found something worth fighting for. As they exchanged vows, Preston's voice was softer than anyone had ever heard it. "You made me see the world differently. You made me want more than what I thought I needed, and every day I'll spend proving that I deserve you." Juliette's eyes shimmered as she whispered, "And I'll spend every day believing it." When they kissed, it wasn't just a promise, it was the beginning of something neither of them had ever expected. And as they walked hand in hand into their future, Preston realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing power or control. He was chasing forever. And he had finally found it.